Welcome to the presentation of a lecture from Gnostic Radio, a free public service from the Gnostic tradition of Samael Aun Weor. Gnosis is the root wisdom of all the world's great religions. Gnosis is a universal teaching of practical science, whose goal is absolute liberation from suffering and the complete development of the human being. This lecture is one of many available by free download or podcast. The hundreds of hours of lectures range in topic and complexity in order to address the many needs of humanity. Each Saturday, Gnostic Radio broadcasts live. The live lecture is accompanied by an online chat, allowing listeners to read additional explanations related to the lecture and providing an opportunity to ask questions of the speaker. To learn how to participate or tune into our continuous web broadcast, visit our website for more information at gnosticradio.org. Gnostic Radio is made possible by the financial support of listeners like you. For more information or to make a donation, visit our website at gnosticradio.org. Now, with heartfelt wishes for the end of suffering for all creatures, we begin the lecture. May all beings be happy. The doorway to knowledge is what we seek when we enter into a religion or any kind of spirituality. That doorway of which Jesus said in the gospel, "Knock, and it shall be opened unto you." But to knock on that doorway, we have to know where it is. And for that, we have many religions in the world, many mystical teachings throughout all the different groups and ages of humanity. But unique to them all, contained within them all, is the same door. The indication or the pointers towards that singular door, which does not rest inside any single religion or in any outside force or group. That door is not in any book. It is not in any priest or preacher or master. The doorway is within ourselves. It's within us. And this is why the oracle of the ancient Greek oracle said, "Man, know thyself." As that doorway that we need to knock upon and pass through is within. The synthesis of all the religions in the world we call gnosis, which is a Greek word that means knowledge. And that synthesis indicates a practical science to discover and utilize that doorway by conscious will. It is not a matter of belief or theory. It's something that we have to perform consciously, psychologically, spiritually, in ourselves. The discovery of that doorway is up to us to find it. We study religion or we study mysticism in order to receive the guidance and instruction to discover that door. But we can only find it if we make the effort, if we actually do our part. In Hebrew, the word for knowledge or gnosis is Daath. It's usually spelled in English D-A-A-T or D-A-A-T-H. Daath, which means knowledge. This is a kind of
special knowledge, which is unique to the consciousness. It is not related to the intellect. It is not related to belief. It is a kind of knowledge that has to be put into practice so that that knowledge can grow and build upon itself and elaborate the creation of the soul. So when we look for the doorway to our own real knowledge, our own real gnosis, if we come from a Christian or a Jewish background, we find that doorway symbolized in the book of Genesis, or Bereshit, the first book of the Bible. That doorway is symbolized in the Garden of Eden as the tree of knowledge of good and evil. That tree of knowledge is Daath. It is the tree of gnosis, the tree of knowledge. And in Hebrew, Daath is spelled with 3 letters: Dalet, Ayin, and Tav. The Hebrew letters, of which there are 22, symbolize and encode the entire path to awaken the consciousness and to have the direct experience of God. The entire path to become a fully developed soul, what someone else might call a Buddha. Daath is that doorway. And we know that's true because the first letter of Daath is Dalet, which symbolizes a door. Dalet is the 4th letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and so it carries the value, the number 4. But its symbol, it represents a doorway. So we know by studying Genesis that it's through the tree of knowledge that Adam and Eve passed out of Eden. They went through the door of Daath, but they made a mistake. They disobeyed the commandment of Jehovah. And because of that, they didn't take the benefits of Daath that were intended for them. Instead, they reaped pain. They ate of the forbidden fruit and went through that doorway of Daath, but into the wilderness, into suffering and death. They returned back to a state, a low state, a state of death, a state of suffering. That door of in Daath, the first letter, Dalet, summarizes what Daath is all about. It tells us that this is a doorway. But that doorway is like any door. You can go through it in 2 directions. Depends on which way you enter and what your will is, how you use that doorway. And the doorway of Daath is the same. That's why it's called the tree of knowledge of good and evil, because there are 2 potential results. But here we have to clarify that good and evil in the context of Daath are not that dualistic notion of right and wrong, or good and evil, the way we always think of it. It's not limited to that sense of duality. It's much richer and deeper than simply good and bad, like the way a child can be good or bad, the way we think of our morals or ethics as good or bad. That form of thinking is very limited. It's dualistic. It's intellectual. It doesn't contain within itself, it doesn't encompass how nature actually works. See, nature in itself is not good or bad, it just is. Nature functions according to laws. And Daath is the same. Daath expresses certain laws. And by application of the knowledge, Daath, we arrive at certain consequences or results. And that's not necessarily good or bad or good or evil. It depends on how we define that. It depends upon how we act and we receive certain results. In other words, the terms, if we get stuck in the intellectual concept of the terms, we'll miss the meaning, the true meaning. The word dalet has these three letters. The word daath. The first letter is dalet. And the second letter is ayin. Ayin is the 16th Hebrew letter. And it symbolizes to see. It symbolizes the eyes, how we perceive. And the third letter, tav, symbolizes the covenant, the seal. It is the 22nd letter, the final letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So it's the seal of the 22. And those 22 letters contain all the knowledge, symbolically. And so the tav is the synthesis of them all. It's the completion, the end, the seal, the covenant. You know, when you sign a contract and somebody seals it at the end, that's tav. In other words, when we look just at the letters of Daath, we see dalet is the doorway, ayin is the eyes to see, and tav is the end of the work. Do you see that? The word Daath contains a message. Through the knowledge, you can arrive at the vision, the insight, the perception of the complete path, of all the work, of all creation, because tav embodies that. You see, the 22 letters symbolize and encompass all the laws that manage everything that exists. Daath is the science to perceive it, to access it. But, as I mentioned, that doorway can go two ways. And that's why in Jeremiah it says, "Thus saith Jehovah, behold, I set before you the way of life and the way of death." These are another way of looking at good and evil. Tob and Ra in Hebrew. The way of life and the way of death. This is a better way to think about good and evil. We tend to think of evil as a guy in a red suit carrying a pitchfork. This is not anything to do with reality. Evil is devolving forces. Anything that is we would call evil is something that is degenerating, something that is descending, something that is harmful to the spirit. And we would call good that which elevates the spirit, that which is ascending. But there's also another path which is beyond good and evil. And this is something beyond the limitations of that dualistic notion. And Daath can lead us to that which is beyond them both. So when we look at the word Daath, we see this character ayin in the middle, which has two yods at the top of its shape. And those two yods look like a pair of eyes. And that symbolizes the duality or the potential outcome of Daath. Two kinds of vision, two kinds of perception that result from knowledge. And in the Bible, the result of that doorway of Daath is symbolized in two kinds of people, prophets and diviners. The prophets in the Bible have the vision of God. They see purely what God shows them. But the diviners see impurely. They see through a glass darkly. They see, but they see a lie. And there's a difference between them. But the diviners don't see the difference. That's the scary part. Is that someone who's awakened the consciousness through the knowledge of Daath sees But do they know how they see? And this is where the science of thought becomes the path of the razor's edge. It's something very delicate. This is why we need to study this science very deeply. When we study the Bible, Genesis or Bereshit, and we study the story of Adam and Eve, we should not take this story literally. It's an initiatic story. It's symbolic. It's psychological. It's spiritual. When we apply the story of Adam and Eve to ourselves, in order to understand how we can access the doorway of thought and how we use knowledge now, we understand that Adam symbolizes our brain and that Eve symbolizes our sexual organs. These are related to two serpents that are draped along our spinal column, the two serpents on the caduceus of Mercury. In India, they're called Ida and Pingala. And in Kabbalah, they're called Od and Ob. And these are two forces, energetic channels, which also relate to Adam and Eve. One is masculine, one is feminine. One is Adam, one is Eve. But one relates to the brain, and one relates to the sex. So in the story of Adam and Eve, Eve is tempted by a serpent to eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge. And if you're familiar with the story, you know that Adam and Eve were warned to not eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge. That they could enjoy all the fruits of the garden, but to not eat that fruit. And the serpent tempts Eve. To understand that, we have to go deep into the Hebrew letters to know what these symbols contain, to understand how this applies to us. Of course, you know already that Eve falls into temptation and eats that fruit and gives it to Adam, which means the sexual organs take something that was forbidden and pass that to the brain, which likes it. But the result is that Adam and Eve are cast out of Eden. They're cast out of that ecstasy or bliss of Eden, the pleasure of bliss. And because of that, suffering begins. This happens to us every day. We persist in these mistakes in ourselves because we don't understand the tree of knowledge in us. This is the whole point that we need to grasp. We have our own Adam and Eve inside. We have Eve, the sexual organs. We have Adam, the brain. And they are constantly being tempted by the serpent, who is Lucifer, the sexual force. That tempting power, that fiery force that resides in sex and that tempts us to eat that fruit, to indulge in that fruit. Whereby, when we do so, that result is passed to the brain, which becomes identified and attached to the sensations of sex in that way. And because of that, Adam and Eve both are cast out of that pleasure into suffering. And this has many levels of meaning, physically, spiritually, psychologically. But as you know in the story, after they eat the fruit, it says that their eyes were opened. Remember that? Their eyes were opened and they saw that they were naked. What else is this but ayin? The central character in the name Daath. Ayin relates to the eyes. In other words, through sex, Adam and Eve have their eyes opened. They see something different. In the story, Adam and Eve realize that they are naked and they feel ashamed. And then they feel afraid. Right? We pass through that. When we're young and the sexual hormones begin to become active in us, we pass through tremendous uncertainties and anxieties about sexuality. And when we begin to experiment with it, we start to feel shame and guilt and uncertainty, and we want to hide what we're doing. We don't want it to be open. We don't tell our parents. We might boast to our friends, but in the places where we are the most intimate, like with our parents or our true loved ones, we feel shame. Relates to our own Adam and Eve and how our own Adam and Eve abuse the tree of knowledge, sex. This is something that we need to get very realistic about. It is the root of our suffering. It is the root of why we cannot see God. You see, the way to use ayin, which is in Daath, to see God, to see like a prophet, is also through using sex, but in the way that God teaches, in the way that's in accordance with Scripture, with the way nature should function in us. So Adam and Eve had their eyes opened, and they saw that they were naked. The result, what this really is saying is that when they abused the tree of knowledge, they inverted the power, the fire of sexuality, and abused that commandment. And so, being naked, they lost the protective innocence, the protective power of a consciousness that is in harmony with the divine. And that nakedness is the feeling of not having God within. It's that feeling of vulnerability, which probably most of us know very well. It's a feeling of being spiritually naked, consciously vulnerable, weak, afraid, ashamed. It doesn't mean physically naked. It's not literal. It's psychological. So we need to learn how to use this doorway in the right way, to be like David. David in the Psalms sang, "Open thou mine eyes, that I may behold wondrous things out of thy law." So David was praying for the help of God to use Daath to open his own eyes and see the law, Daath. The door to do that is the same door that Jesus mentioned, which is one path, right? One door. There's not multiple doors. There's one. Jesus didn't say there were many paths. He said there's one path, and it's narrow, and it's difficult, and it's hard to find. Many people go the easy way, which means they use Daath, sex, and become under the hypnosis of the serpent, and they follow that path to destruction. Very few conquer temptation and take that narrow path, which is difficult, but is the path to life. To understand that, we can look to see how these two words for good and evil are in Hebrew. The word for good is tob, which is also 3 letters. The first letter is tet. And tet represents a serpent. In its shape, you can see a serpent curled in its head. That is the tempting serpent. It is also the healing serpent of Moses. And if you haven't read that story about the 2 kinds of serpent in the book of Numbers, you should. This is the serpent that's always present on the tree of knowledge. Now what's interesting is that tet, this letter, which represents a serpent, is also the 9th letter in the Hebrew alphabet. And if you relate that to the Sephirah of the tree of life, you see that the 9th sphere, counting downwards, is Yesod, which is placed directly over the sexual organs. So when you place the tree of life over your body, you see that Yesod is sex. And Yesod is related to Tet, which is the serpent. And this is where we are tempted by the serpent, in sex. The second letter in Tob is a Vav, which is a straight line. And the Vav represents the spinal column. The Vav is the 6th letter of the Hebrew alphabet. This is also significant. We'll come back to that. But it's through the spinal column that God creates. You remember in the Bible, it always says, and God said, let there be light. And God saw that it was good. And God created this and that. Vav means and, if it's placed at certain places in a sentence. So after Tob, if we look in the Bible at the tree of knowledge of good and evil, it says Tob ve ra. And the ve there is a vav, which means and. It's through the spinal column that God creates, through the vav. And it's through the spine that we are tempted by the serpent. That energy of sexuality, when we conquer the serpent, will rise up the spine, which is what makes what we call the second womb. This is how the soul is created in us. The third letter is Bet. Bet is the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which represents a house or a temple of God, the house of God. And Bet is also the creative power of the Divine Mother. Bet is related to the powers of creation. If you remember that in Hebrew, the first book of the Bible is called Bereshit, which means creation. The first letter is Bet. And it's through that Bet that the rest of the Bible comes out. It emerges from that Bet. So you see, Tob has the serpent, the spine, and the house where creation occurs. Tob means good. So the tree of the knowledge of good. The good is first. Through Tob, or this goodness, the upright creation can occur. The creation of the real man. Or the re-establishing of Adam and Eve in Eden. What we need is to follow the path of Tob, the good path, the upright path, in order to recover our place back in Eden, so then we can go further than that and become a fully developed soul. You see, just returning to Eden is only fixing the mistake. Then we still have a whole other thing to do after that. Tob, in synthesis, these three letters relate with, as I mentioned, how God creates the real man. It's good because it's related with our own goodness, which in Hebrew is Gedulah. And Gedulah is another name for this sphere on the tree of life called Chesed. This is related with our own inner spirit, who in the Bible is the Ruach Elohim, the spirit that hovers over the waters in the process of creation. Those first 6 days of Genesis symbolize how our own spirit, the Ruach Elohim, our goodness, creates the real man in us, creates Adam, in other words, the Adam that belongs in Eden. So in other words, if we follow the path of Tob, we utilize our sexual forces to empower our own inner spirit to bring us back into Eden. So that's the synthesis of that. But unfortunately, as you know, Adam and Eve do not follow that path. In the Bible, in ancient times, this happened on a macrocosmic level with humanity as a whole. But it happens in us psychologically, daily. Because daily, we allow our own inner Adam and Eve to abuse the fruit of the tree of knowledge, to abuse the energy, our own sexual force. And instead of following the path of Tob, we follow the path of Ra, which in Hebrew means pollution or evil or that which is harmful. And the result of that, of course, is that Adam and Eve are cast out of Eden and they give birth to Cain and Abel, which is the birth of murder, jealousy, and all the problems that are described throughout the rest of the Bible. I already told you that this third word here means and evil. So The vav means and then you have two letters, resh and ayin. The resh symbolizes the head, our own head, where we have the brain, Adam. And the ayin are the eyes, again. When we fall into the temptation of the serpent, we awaken the ayin, the vision within the head related to the pineal and pituitary glands. But God is not there. There's nothing for God there. It's just that. It's pollution, evil. It's very interesting to study this word ra, or evil, in the Hebrew language. And when we look in the Zohar, there's a very clear description of this, which I'll read to you, talking about the flood and what happened after humanity became very much a slave of ra, evilness. It says this in the Zohar. It is written, and God saw that the wickedness of men upon the earth was great, and all the imaginations and thoughts of their hearts were only on evil continually. Said Rabbi Yehuda, Thou art not a God that hath pleasure in wickedness, neither shall evil dwell with thee. Observe that he who gives way to the temper and suffers himself to be led and guided by it defiles not only himself but also those with whom he comes into personal contact. As already stated, though the wickedness of those before the flood was great, and their evil deeds were many, yet was the Holy One unwilling to destroy them, but long-suffering towards them. Notwithstanding, and their shameful propensities and heinous practices, of which it is written that they were only evil continually. Their evil actions are denoted by the word ra, pollution. Of Er, the eldest son of Judah, who was guilty of this sin, it is written that he was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord slew him. Now, I'm going to pause there to explain Er. In the Bible, in the book of Genesis, we read about the son of Judah. And there's only one line written about this son, Er. And it says, Er was so wicked that God had him killed immediately. But what's interesting is that the name Er is Ra spelled backwards. It's Ayin Resh. And his wickedness is not stated explicitly. But when you analyze this, you see that it was fornication. As a son of Judah, as a son of the tribe of Israel, as a son, as an initiate, he abused the tree of knowledge. So the Zohar continues. Is not this sin synonymous with what is termed rashang, wickedness or wrongdoing? And this is the way we usually think of evil, that evil is just doing things bad, like wicked things. And the Zohar says, no, replied Rabbi Yehuda, for rashang is applied to intentional evil before it becomes actual. But ra refers to him who defiles himself by the dissipation of his vital powers. In other words, fornication, abuse of sexual energy. And thus gives himself up to the unclean spirit called Ra. He who thus renders himself impure will never attain unto the divine life, nor behold the face of the Shekinah, whose disappearance from the world previous to the flood was owing to the vice termed Ra. Woe unto him who indulges in it, for he will never experience the joy of living, Eden, in the presence of the Holy One, but will drag on through life as a degraded captive and miserable slave of Ra, the unclean spirit. To me, that description sounds like us, this humanity, because we are slaves of Ra. We are slaves of the unclean spirit that is within us. That unclean spirit we call in Gnosis the ego. Pride, envy, jealousy, fear, anger, gluttony, laziness. All of those psychological attributes that utilize our energy in the wrong way. But they all have their root in sexual energy. All of them. So this unclean spirit, or Ra, is within us. It is not outside. The Zohar continues, "The fear of the Lord leadeth to life, and bringeth peaceful nights free from visits of the impure spirit Ra. And therefore it is written, Ra shall not dwell with thee. Only the pure in life and thought and deed can say, Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will not be afraid of Ra, for thou art with me and causes me to dwell in the house of the Lord forever." So the Zohar, which is this mystical text that explains the Kabbalah to us, it's very clear. Only the pure in heart, thought, and deed can claim to be free of the spirit of Ra, that impure spirit. In other words, we must eliminate the ego. There's no exception to this. Those who have this impure spirit within cannot come into the presence of God. The scriptures are unequivocal. There are no exceptions. There's no way around it. But unfortunately, in these times, there are many, many teachings, many rabbis, many New Age people, many Gnostics who are teaching methods or theories that say you don't have to dissolve the ego. They teach how to use the sexual energy, perhaps. They may teach transmutation. They may teach meditation, astral projection. They may teach about Daath. They may talk about the ego. But without the practical knowledge of how to actually eliminate the ego every day, that impure spirit, Ra, remains alive in us. That's a great danger. And it's very sad that so many teachings avoid giving the full knowledge. There are some groups who actually teach, and who are very popular, by the way, who teach that if you simply stop paying attention to the ego, it dissolves on its own. You'll see this talked about on television now, this idea. It's very popular. But it is a lie. What these groups forget, what they don't understand, is that matter and energy are co-interdependent with each other. The ego is a crystallization of sexual forces that are not physical, but that are emotional and mental. And those crystallizations are within our own mind. We can call it the unconscious, or the subconscious, or the infraconscious, or we can just call it hell. We can call it klipoth. But that level of our own psychology has matter. The ego is matter. It is a formation that traps energy. And until that matter is removed, that energy remains imprisoned. You can ignore it all you want, but it does not go away. This is the great mistake that these groups make. They believe that there is a way to extract that energy and leave that matter behind, and this is impossible. That energy and that matter are synonymous with each other. In order to free the energy, the matter must be destroyed. Simple as that. This is a basic function in physics. So in other words, what these groups teach is how to awaken this ayin in our resh, in our head, and develop insight, powers, clairvoyance, vision, but through the ego, through Ra, through impurity, through pollution. This is what we call a diviner or a seer. Someone who has developed powers, but with the ego still alive. This is what we call a demon, in other words. They might look like a regular physical person. They might think they're a regular physical person. but their soul is becoming demonic because the consciousness is awakening inside the ego and God is not there. We can also call these people the Baalim, which is a sort of respectful term, which means sir. It's in order to not give them anything more accurate. The way this occurs is through our use of our own energies, through will. From moment to moment, constantly, our whole organism, psychologically and physically, is receiving and transforming energy. We use that energy according to how we use our consciousness. Wherever you place your attention, you are directing forces, energies. And there is a reciprocal event that occurs. When you begin to pay attention to something, you're putting energy into that something, and you develop a relationship with it. This is natural. It's part of how nature functions. And thus, when you choose to invest your energy into being angry, or to being lustful, or to feeling a desire, or indulging in a desire, you are falling under the temptation of your own serpent, Lucifer, who is tempting that energy. And you fall into that and become hypnotized by your desire. That energy then creates in your mind a formation. It is matter. It is real. It is something that exists in the mental plane and emotionally in the astral plane. But it is a false creation. It is what we call an ego or a shell. This is where we get the word klipot, which is a word that refers to the lower realms below Malkuth in the Tree of Life. Klipot means the world of the shells. And that is our own subconscious, unconscious, and infraconscious levels of our own mind. Those areas that, for us, are darkness. We don't see them because we're blind. We're blind to all those things internally because we have not utilized the power of Daath to awaken our eyes. The function of this all occurs through this letter Vav, which represents the spinal column. And remember, the letter Vav is the 6th letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And if you've studied the Tarot, the arcana, you know that the number 6 relates to indecision. It's represented in the graphic of that arcana, that arcanum, is a man trapped between two women, a virgin and a whore, and he has to choose between them. This is where we are all the time when the serpent in us is tempting us to choose. Do we choose to use our energy, to use our time, to use our mind and our heart and our body to serve the virgin, the Divine Mother, our own Divine Mother? Or do we use those energies to serve the whore, Lilith, Nahimah, Jezebel, who is in us? And we choose that in each moment according to how we behave, how we think, how we feel, how we use those energies. That process is happening through Vav, because that is our own spine. And what happens in our spinal column? Eve is at the base, which is where that energy arrives, the sexual organs. All the root base energy of our whole organism and psychology is there in sex. When Eve is tempted and uses sexual energy to feed her desire, she uses that energy and sends it up the spine to Adam and infects the brain with the taste and lust and desire for sensations of pleasure. Even if those are not explicitly sexual, right, on the surface. It may just be we have a situation with someone that we're envious of, and we indulge in that envy. Using that sexual energy, the brain becomes addicted to that sensation of envy. And we become used to it. We start to like it. even though it's a form of suffering. This is what happens with drug addicts and alcoholics. This is what happens with people who are manic, people who are depressed. They become habituated to sensations, and they start to like it. The same happens with people who are undergoing torture, who are put in jail. They become used to it, and they start to think it's normal. And they start to crave it. This is what's happened to us. It sounds weird, and the mind says that can't be, but it's true. And when you really become honest with yourself and you start looking into your behaviors, you start to see things that you know you shouldn't do, but that you like to do. And we all have them. And we each have our idiosyncrasy. Some of us really like to feel afraid, to feel insecure, to feel anxious. I would bet you that most of us, even though we wouldn't admit it, we actually like to feel stressed because we've become used to it. And now when we feel stressed, we feel like we're doing something, like we're part of life. We're being successful because we're stressed out. When we feel relaxed, we feel uncomfortable, like we're not doing our work, we're not doing something. You ever notice that? When you start to really relax, you start getting worried and anxious because you're not stressed. Why is that? Because we become habituated to these harmful states of being. The end result here, for us, commonly, is that we simply suffer. We use these energies to cultivate and strengthen all these unconscious and subconscious and infraconscious desires, fears, anxieties, cravings, aversions, all of that stuff that surges in the mind, about which we don't know, because we're in darkness, we're blind, we don't even see ourselves. However, if we've learned something about Daath, if we've learned something about Tantra, and about how to consciously use this energy, the sexual energy, then the stakes go up. Then the game is really on. The problem is that many of the groups and movements who teach about the transmutation of sexual energy do not teach about the elimination of the ego. So the students begin to practice Karma Mudra, Maituna, Tantra, Taoism, many techniques to hold, restrain, and utilize the sexual energy. But because they're not eliminating the ego, their own inner Eve is taking that energy and feeding it to Adam, the brain. Right? All that energy is moving up the Vav. So there is a creation that's occurring related with the spine in this womb. But the creation is related with Ra. The result is all that energy begins to stimulate and activate the pituitary gland and the pineal gland in the brain. You see, the sexual energy is a very powerful, potent force. It's the very force of being. It's the force of life. And when that energy suffuses the brain, saturates the brain, the pituitary and pineal glands become activated. In most of us, they're completely atrophied. But when those glands become activated, and we're using our consciousness by will to direct sexual energy, but not eliminating ego, those glands awaken the chakras related with clairvoyance. The result is a diviner, a clairvoyant, but someone who sees through the filter of the I, the ego. This is how demons are made. This is how suffering is deepened. In other words, through this method, the eyes are opened in Ra, this ayin of Resh and Ayin. But those eyes are opened in hell, in Klipot. This type of person who has this experience is able to see clearly in Klipot, in limbo, and in worlds lower than that. But to them, it looks like heaven. To them, it looks like they're with angels and gods because they are seeing through the filter of their own subconscious mind. They're seeing the projections of their own mind, not the truth. And the problem is, all of us who learn gnosis, who learn transmutation, will face this because we all have ego. And even if we're working to eliminate ego and we're trying to harness the sexual energy, we start to awaken our own inner sight, our own ayin, the ability to see, but then we don't know, are we seeing in hell or are we seeing in heaven? But we get so excited because we see something in meditation or out of the body that we immediately think it's in heaven. We lack discrimination. This is a very serious problem that the students will face if they persist in this effort. In synthesis, those who do not eliminate the ego, those who follow whatever path, whether they're transmuting or not, if they're using energy and not eliminating ego, they're following the path of Ra, the impure spirit. Even if they think they're a holy one, even if they're a priest, even if they're a bishop or a great lama, it doesn't matter. What matters is the actual works that are performed consciously in the soul. That's what matters. The result of that is symbolized in the Bible. Adam and Eve, having been cast out of Eden, have children, Cain and Abel. Of course, we know the story. Cain murders Abel. This is the beginning of all these problems: jealousy, murder, suffering. And from that result, from following that path, the inner tree of knowledge of that person, the Daath within them, does not bring forth good fruit. The result of using the fruit of the sexual energy does not bring forth good fruit. Do you follow that? The result is that this tree within that person is fruitless in the eyes of God. To the person, it seems bountiful because they seem to be having all kinds of spiritual bounty. But in the eyes of God, it's not. And that's why Jesus said, "And now also the axe is laid unto the root of the trees. Every tree, therefore, which bringeth not forth good fruit is hewn down and cast into the fire." This is what Jesus was referring to. That tree of knowledge in us. The way it brings forth good fruit is when we follow the path of Tob, the path of good. And this is by following chastity. But it's not mere transmutation. Mere transmutation is only part of the equation. Be very clear about that. Many people study Gnosis or Tantra and think transmutation is the sum of the teaching, and that is the whole thing. It is not. The main thing is the death of the ego, the most important. You can transmute all you want, but if you don't work on your ego, you're going on a mistaken path. This needs to be very explicit in your mind. This is why in the Gospels also Jesus says, "If thine eye offend thee, pluck it out and cast it from thee. For it is better for thee to enter into life with one eye rather than having two eyes to be cast into hellfire." This eye that he's referring to is not our physical eye. It is our consciousness. You see, the consciousness is what gives us the ability to perceive. Perception can occur in any of the levels of nature, symbolized in the map of the tree of life. We see physically through the physical eyes because we have consciousness. But what we see is filtered by the conditioning of our consciousness. That's something you really should consider. What you see is not what is actually there. until your consciousness is completely awakened and your ego is completely dead, you do not see the truth. We don't have right view, the view of prajna, or the view of the two truths simultaneously, until the ego is 100% dead. And a person who's acquired that is a person like Buddha or Jesus or Krishna or Muhammad. Not us. We're not like that. So let's not listen to those groups that tell us we're already gods. We're already angels and Buddhas. This is all a lie. This is all self-deception based in fear. You see, these groups are so effective now in telling these lies because we're all so afraid. And we want to believe in something that makes us feel good. So it's very easy for us to listen to these ideas of, oh, you don't have to eliminate the ego. You're already an angel. You're already a Buddha. All you have to do is realize it. This is a lie. It contains a truth because we have the potential in us to become a Buddha or an angel. But not while the ego is alive. No way. Impossible. The ego traps that Buddha. That Buddha is in hell. Not because of God, but because of us. No one else did this to us. We cannot blame God. We cannot blame angel Sakaki. We cannot blame Lucifer. We cannot blame Satan because we are Satan. We ourselves are the devil who created suffering. So don't blame anyone else for your pain. Blame yourself and now solve it. The way to solve it is to use your energy wisely. This is why Jesus says, if thine eye offend thee, pluck it out. Who is thee? Who is the real thee within? It is God. It is Gejula. It is our goodness, our own spirit. In other words, if the vision, the ayin of our eye offends our spirit, pluck it out. Kill that ego. Destroy it. But it's not as simple as saying it, or as simple as saying, well, I'm not going to listen to that ego anymore. This is just repression and avoidance. The way you dissolve an ego is through very deep, penetrative consciousness of that. You have to know yourself. You have to know very deeply all of the impurities that are within your mind. This is the only way you can stop being fooled by your own mind. You know that old saying, keep your friends close, but keep your enemies closer? The meaning in that is, you need to know very well what your enemies are doing. Your friends, you can just leave them be. But your enemies, if you ignore them, you've committed yourself to failure. If you ignore your enemies, they will get you. Period. Because they know you're not looking. Then you're easy. You're an easy target. Unfortunately, we are that. We start hearing about this talk about the ego and Adam and Eve within us and lust and pride, and we don't want to hear it. We want to hear how good we are, that we're all angels, that we're all prophets, that we're all on this ascending arch of evolution and humanity is about to enter into a big golden age. And we all want to feel good. This is all a lie. None of that will happen as long as the ego's alive. There will be a golden age, but no ego's allowed. Zero. If your ego is alive, that ego cannot go there. And if you want to go and be a part of some heavenly realm, you have to vibrate in that level. You have to belong in that world. Right now, we don't. So if our eye offends our own inner spirit, we need to pluck it out. We need to eliminate that ego. Also in the Gospels, Jesus says this, the light of the body is the eye. If therefore thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be full of light. But if thine eye be evil, thy whole body shall be full of darkness. If therefore the light that is in thee be darkness, how great is that darkness? So when we sit to meditate, do we see light or darkness? When we close our eyes, when we imagine God, do we see light or darkness? Usually we see darkness. Usually when we look to see what's in us, we don't see anything. We see darkness. When we want to resolve a problem in our life, we don't see solutions. We see darkness. Psychological darkness, spiritual darkness. Not literal. To be in the dark means to not know which way to go, to not be able to see your way around, to not be able to navigate through life. And this is our case. None of us know where we're going today or tomorrow, our karma, what's coming for us, when death is going to arrive, whether tomorrow will be good or bad. We have no idea. We're completely in the dark. And that's because our own insight is blind. We are blind. So Jesus says the light of the body is the eye. But when you look into the Greek, it's more accurate to say the illumination of the self is the vision. This is what the Greek says. That's totally different. It's not talking about the physical body. He's talking about the way that you become illuminated and see your way is through your ayin, through your inner vision, which is here in the midst of Daath. Directly in between the door and the completion of the work is ayin, that vision. And he says this, if therefore thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be full of light. Let's put this back to what the real Greek says. It means, if thine vision be singular, pure, not multifaceted and divided into a billion egos, but is one light from God, thy whole self will be full of light, like Moses. You see, Moses always has rays of light, and he was said to radiate so much light, it was hard to look at him because his face was so bright with consciousness. Jesus the same. This is a light that emerges that's not physical light, not literal light, conscious light. In other words, Jesus is saying, if thine eye offend thy spirit, pluck it out. It's better to have one eye, remember that? And enter into the path of life. That one eye, that one vision, is the pure vision that we can reach through Daath, through knowledge. That singular eye, which is the clairvoyance, divine clairvoyance, pure clairvoyance, or pure inner vision of the prophet. If the ego is alive, this is filtered and impure. So that phrase that theologians have been arguing about for centuries is actually very simple when you look to the Hebrew and the Greek, when you look at what is actually written there. So what we have to do is make our own tree of knowledge good. We have to convert our tree of knowledge and make it fruitful. Remember God says, be fruitful and multiply? He's not talking about physically. He's talking about spiritually. To make Daath bear fruit, spiritual fruit, conscious fruit. And that's why he says this, either make the tree good and his fruit good, or else make the tree corrupt and his fruit corrupt, for the tree is known by his fruit. That means that our own tree, our own Daath inside, is known by the fruit that we ourselves create. And so what fruit do we have in our lives? This is the question for us. He says, every man is known by his fruit. Right? Where is the fruit in our life? What fruit do we have to show? Spiritually. We're in darkness. Do we have the ability to meditate and see God face to face and receive the guidance that we need? If not, we need to make our own tree fruitful. To water that tree and nourish it with the following the good path. And the way we do that is we follow the guidance that is encoded in this tradition. We follow the steps to stop breaking the law, but instead follow the path of Tov, goodness. It's very interesting to see how that path is presented in different ways in different religions, but always contains the same essential tools. And I started by telling you that what we want is to enter the doorway into real knowledge, right? To see for ourselves, to have gnosis ourselves, to see God, to get guidance from God, not from a book or a person, but inside. And the way we do that is by using this doorway in Daath. But that doorway is inside of us. That doorway is in our own resh, but that resh has to be made pure. Resh is our head. That doorway begins in Yasod, in sex, through the serpent, the first character of Tob. It ascends up the spinal column as we utilize those energies in the right way through transmutation and through conscious will. It is creative through Bet of Tob. This is how we initiate genesis in ourselves to create the real man. And in this way, we start to utilize these forces and pass through a series of tests and initiations that help us to see the ego and remove it. This is the great help that Lucifer provides to us. The tempter has his place. He serves God. If you studied the book of Job, you see that Lucifer only tempts according to the guidance of God. Do you realize that? In the book of Job, Lucifer goes to God and says, "Can I tempt him?" And God says, "Sure, but only to a limit." And Lucifer says, "Cool." And he goes and does it. Same is true in us. That serpent is here, the first letter of Tob, in us, who tempts us. And that is the temptations we pass through in the stages of initiation as we raise that energy up the Vav, the spinal column. This is a slow process and is not easy. It's symbolized in the book of Revelation, believe it or not, by the 7 churches in Asia, not Asia. Asia relates to the physical body. It's the first kingdom, the first world of Kabbalah. The first few books of Revelation detail the process of working through the 7 churches in Asia, which are the 7 chakras of Hinduism and Buddhism. Those 7 chakras are energetic centers along our own spinal column through which that energy must pass as we raise each serpent of the Kundalini. And each process is a process of psychological examination, within which we have to see our I, our ego, and conquer it, little by little. This is the role that Lucifer plays, guiding us in this, presenting us with temptations, and we have to overcome them. But what's very interesting is when we arrive to the head, the 2 primary chakras or churches that we need to know about are related with the pituitary and pineal glands. And in the book of Revelation, they are described in this way. And to the angel of the church in Philadelphia, which is the chakra Achna, related to the third eye, these things saith he that is holy, he that is true, he that hath the key of David, the key to the door, he that openeth and no man shutteth, and shutteth and no man openeth. I know thy works. Behold, I have set before thee an open door. This is the first place the door is mentioned in Revelation. The door of Dalet, the first letter of knowledge. That door is in the pituitary gland, related with clairvoyance. The door to vision, ayin. I have set before thee an open door, and no man can shut it, for thou hast a little strength, and hast kept my word, and hast not denied my name. So in other words, the person is starting to show a little perseverance in the path, but they don't have much strength yet. And it continues to explain what's needed to go further, which is patience, and to hold true. A little bit later it says, and to the angel of the church of the Laodiceans, which is the chakra Sahasrara, which is in the pineal gland. These things saith the Amen, the faithful and true witness, the beginning of the creation of God. Remember, creation is under Bet, right, in Tob. That creation happens through the spine and is the first letter of Bereshit, Genesis, creation, and those 6 days are how we create Adam. So, the beginning of the creation of God, I know thy works. Again, I know. Daath, knowledge. In other words, God knows what we are, who we are, and what we're doing. And it says a little bit later, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If any man hear my voice and open the door, I will come into him and will sup with him and he with me. To him that overcometh will I grant to sit with me in my throne, even as I also overcame and am set down with my Father in his throne. The throne is the pineal gland. This is the crown of life. This is where that energy rises all the way to the spine, top of the spine, reaches the pineal gland, and divine sight is opened. This process is a combination of these two churches, Philadelphia and Laodicea, Achna and Sahasrara in Sanskrit. When those two churches or chakras are awakened, clairvoyance is awakened, and polyvoyance. This is divine sight of the prophet who sees by the power of God in Daath without ego. That's why it's difficult to arrive to. The full completion of that, when that process is fully accomplished, which is many stages, symbolized in 7, but 6 days of Genesis to create the complete man. If you read the 6th day of Genesis, this is the only day that God says is very good. The other days, he completes the work of that day and says, and God saw that it was good. Right? And God saw. The and is the vav, through the spine. But on the 6th day, he says, it was very good. It was tob mad. But the word very in Hebrew is written with dalet, aleph, mem. The same letters as Adam. In other words, on the 6th day, when the completion of creation is done, Adam is restored back to Eden. And we have then a man. So in synthesis, what we need to do is to perform that creation in ourselves, to return to the tree of knowledge, but to not eat the fruit, to enjoy the aroma, to enjoy all the benefits of it without eating it, which means to not indulge, to restrain the senses, to control lust, to not be tempted by the serpent. And when we accomplish that day by day, we need to use that energy to eliminate our problems. Not outside, inside. Psychological problems. It's these problems that filter our vision. We don't see the fact of our life, the truth of what's around us, because our perceptions are filtered by our resentments, by our memories, by our desires, by our fears. We only allow ourselves to see according to what we want to see. We don't want to see the truth, and that's why we're blind. To see the truth, we have to awaken the consciousness. This is possible for anyone to do, but we cannot do it alone. We have to follow the steps exactly, but we need help, and that help comes from inside. It comes from our own goodness, chesed, gedula, but it also comes from Christ. You remember here in Revelation it says, at the 7th church, these things saith the Amen, the faithful and true witness, the beginning of the creation of God. This Amen is related with the supernal triangle, Keter, Hokmah, Binah. This is the cosmic Christ, that illuminating force of light, the Ein Sof Or, which illuminates everything. And for us to see the light, to see what actually is, we need the help of that light, which is Christ. But that Christ is not outside. It's inside. That is something we earn. We earn it by our works, by our deeds. That help is symbolized here in the book of John, where it says, and Jesus passed by. Now, Jesus here represents Yeshua, which is the Savior, Christ. It's not Jesus the person. This story is symbolic. It says, and Jesus passed by, he saw a man which was blind from his birth. Blind because of the abuse of the tree of knowledge. Blind like Samson, who is seduced by Delilah, the night, Lilith, and who, because of lust, lost his strength, his power. And his disciples asked him, saying, Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus, Yeshua, answered, Neither hath this man sinned, nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made manifest in him. Now, how are we to understand this? If we know that karma, cause and effect, is the basis of everything, this man is blind. So why would he be blind if not for consequences? Because Jesus says he's not blind because of any sin, but that God's works may be shown through him. The answer is, this man already eliminated the cause of that sin. He's blind, but he eliminated the ego. And so he's awaiting Christ to illuminate him. Right? So it says, I, Christ, must work the works of him that sent me. And that is the Ein Sof Or. While it is day, when the sun, the Christ, is there. The night, or Delilah, comes in Klipoth when no man can work. Right? So long as I, the light, Christ, am in the world, I am the light of the world. Do you remember Jesus says, if thine eye be single, thine body will be full of light? That is the world. When Christ is within, then we see, when we have illuminated vision. When he had thus spoken, he spat on the ground and made clay of the spittle, and he anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay. And he said unto him, Go wash in the pool of Siloam. He went his way, therefore, and washed, and came back, seeing. So Jesus healed the blind man's sight, but with a very beautiful symbol. When Jesus spits on the ground, he's taking that sacred water from the mouth, where the word emerges, the logos. That water is Shamayim, the superior waters of the Upper Eden, which are related with Daath. If you remember from other lectures, there are two Edens. Daath related with Shamayim, which is usually translated as heaven, but means fiery water. And the Mayim, or lower Eden, and Yesod. That spit emerges from Daath through the throat of Jesus. This is the transmuted sexual fiery water, the guidance of Christ for an initiate, for someone who transmutes. But that spit, that liquid fire, he places in the earth, Adamah, which means ground, earth in Hebrew. And this is where we take Adam. Do you know that Adam comes from the dust of the earth? Right? This is how the soul is created. This is how Adam is created. That fiery water mixed with the earth and then is extracted and heals the man's sight. You see the beautiful symbolism? Completely Kabbalistic. If you don't know Kabbalah, it doesn't make any sense. Why would he spit on the guy's eye with dirt? It doesn't mean anything. But when you know what the Kabbalistic symbols are, it's beautiful. It's showing this deep relationship of why these waters need to descend to the earth and rise again. And this is the process of the path. The path is hard, but only because we have made it hard. The aid of Christ is there for us if we take it. The path is only hard because of our own ego, which we made. And the more we delay and the more we avoid it, the harder it becomes. As you know, an energy, how do I put that in words? If we ignore it, we can't control it. In other words, If we're ignoring what's happening in our subconscious mind, our unconscious mind, our infraconscious mind, then we're not in control. So we're blind. To receive the aid that this blind man received, we have to eliminate that. Jesus said it's not due to his sin because that sin was already absolved. That man did not have that sin anymore. He had done his part, and then Christ comes to illuminate him. This is possible for any of us if we do our part. Do you have any questions?
Yeah. I hear great descriptions of egos these days. Through these new groups, New Age groups, schools, they describe ego as illusion, right? And antidote to ego is also illusion. So they say, why should we even bother, right? And they seem to start. They say, I'll start from this point on to the future with upright thoughts, upright feelings, upright actions, compassion, love, And they say, why should I care about what I did in the past if that is also illusion? If ego is illusion in the past. And to me, it seems like the point that's missing there is that the illusion in the past had a cause and effect. And it's stored in the subconscious because of that. And to somehow work on the ego, where it's subconsciously stored, is not beneficial to them, it seems.
It seems to me that their whole point of view is an illusion.
Yes.
You cannot dispel an illusion with an illusion. People who say the ego is an illusion are people who lie to themselves and other people, who are not being sincere and looking into themselves to see the causes of suffering. There's a very important aspect of our tradition that I think deserves emphasis, which is that we don't make stuff up. Our point of view in studying this teaching is to analyze the most ancient teachings of this humanity and to discover that practical truth that's within all of them. If you applied the same rigorous analysis to a lot of these New Age teachings, they will completely fall apart. They don't stand up to comparison to our ancient scriptures. They are revealed to be what they are, which is just marketing. Most of these New Age teachings are just clever marketing. That's all they are. They contain no truth. They contain no ability to generate and sustain true change. So when we study Gnosis and we analyze this teaching, we try to understand this teaching, it's in the light of teachings that have been around for thousands of years and teachings that have been not only delivered by great initiates, but utilized by great initiates and proven, right? These new ideas that are coming out in bookstores now, nobody's proven them. They just sound good. But when put to the test, there's nothing there. The fact remains that every great religion is explicit in its symbolism about the destruction of the ego. Every religion. And it's only nowadays that you have these groups saying that the destruction of the ego is not necessary. And they're saying that because it sounds good. The thing is that people now are suckers for anything that sounds easy. If it sounds easy and it sounds comfortable, I'll do it, sure. Only $29.95. Right? And if the talk show host is doing it, it must be good. Right? We can believe talk show hosts because they know. I'm sorry, but for me personally, I'd rather rely on Jesus or Buddha. The Dalai Lama talks explicitly about eliminating the ego. It is illusion, but it's real too. This is the problem, and this is the same problem that certain Tibetan schools propagate. Yes, the ego is an illusion. It is Maya. But that doesn't mean it is without matter or energy. This is the fundamental problem that happened in Buddhism centuries ago and in Hinduism that caused a great split in various schools. And this is this intellectual debate about truth. The problem is that when you analyze the scriptures like Vedanta or Madhyamaka or certain tantric scriptures that talk about the nature of Maya or illusion, they state very clearly, especially in the higher schools like Dzogchen, that the ego is illusion. So it doesn't exist. It's not real. Therefore, we should just awaken consciousness and disregard the ego. So a lot of these modern groups are sort of taking that as their evidence. But what they fail to realize is that that teaching belongs to the 9th yana, the highest tantra. And to reach that, you have to first comprehended all the other ones, which all state that the ego is real and must be eliminated. So how do you resolve that apparent contradiction, right? It isn't that the Dzogchen or Mahamudra practitioners or the Taoist practitioners ignore the ego. What happens is someone who's genuinely, consciously reached the level of working at that level has developed right view, which is the capacity to perceive prajna, wisdom. And that prajna is the ability to see the true truths simultaneously. That person recognizes that conventional truth exists, and so does ultimate truth. In other words, you have a physical body, but it doesn't exist. And there's no contradiction. You do have a physical body, but it's mostly empty air. The ego is the same. You have an ego, but it doesn't exist.
Doesn't mean it's impermanent.
Well, it is impermanent, but avoiding it does not cause it to cease to exist. This is the misconception. And there are certain tantric Buddhist groups who teach this, that you don't need to worry about the ego. You just awaken your consciousness. Don't worry about the ego. And the result is they all awaken their consciousness, but in the ego, and they don't realize it. They awaken their consciousness, but as demons, as devils.
Swami Rama said that, asketh is illusionary also. So it's like a magician that covers one trick, right, with another trick.
It's true, but you have to see it at the level he's talking. He's talking about the highest Tantra yoga, Dzogchen. And in the perspective of Dzogchen, it's true. Right? It is true. But until you can consciously, with awakened consciousness, perceive that, you're wasting your time. This is why that in all the ancient times, throughout centuries, those teachings were hidden. Because we who are asleep cannot understand it. We who are asleep, who are blind, who have no spiritual vision, hear that the ego is illusion. So we think, oh, good. I'm ready to go to heaven. No, we're asleep. And those teachings were hidden because we can't get it until we awaken. And when we awaken, we can understand it a little bit. But it's not easy. Dzogchen and Mahamudra and the teachings that relay that profound knowledge are very difficult to grasp, even with the consciousness. With the intellect, it is impossible. Impossible. But unfortunately, all these groups now are misleading people. Yes?
On the flip side, can you tell about the people groups who are saying that the teachings given here, given by Master Samael, are illusions themselves, that they're not real, and that it's just to control people. So that, in other words, they give an excuse to continue fornicating, and also to continue to get angry, to continue to be full of pride, to continue to be envious, etc., etc., etc.
The bottom line with both these cases is beautifully summarized in the conclusion of the book, The Perfect Matrimony. When Samael Aun Weor had a very emotional and troubling experience in the internal worlds, awakened consciousness, where he saw how few people are coming into the light. And what he said was, Satan has enticed them. And an angel said, yes, it's true. Satan has enticed them. Only a handful of people genuinely reach the light. And it's not Satan outside of us. It's the Satan inside of us. And we'll have a billion reasons and justifications for why we avoid the real teaching. All these groups have beautiful, intellectual, logical, very reasonable concepts behind their point of view. And if you approach it logically and reasonably, you will believe them. And that's because the most dangerous demons work in the mind. The most dangerous forces that we face outside of us work through our mind, tempting our mind, and getting our own mind to say, yeah, that makes sense. Why should I bother with all this stuff that Gnosis says? It's too hard. It doesn't make sense. Because our own inner Satan is whispering, repeating what those outside sources said. So yeah, that makes sense. Ego is illusion. I'll just forget about it. Sounds easy. It is easy. You will awaken consciousness that way. I guarantee it. If you avoid your ego but transmute your sexual energy, you will awaken consciousness. You will have experiences. But unfortunately, you will also enter into hell. Because the ego cannot go to heaven. That's the law. As beautiful a story we may tell ourselves and as sublime and attractive as our theory or religion might be, no idolater, no murderer, no fornicator, no thief, no covetousness, none of that can ascend into the higher realms. None. And we have all of it. Ignoring it doesn't get rid of it. Saying it's illusion doesn't get rid of it. Trying to be a good person day to day is great, but it doesn't get rid of the ego. There's only one way to get rid of the ego, and that's by using a power that is superior to the mind. That power is the Divine Mother. The Kundalini, which is here. The Vav, the spinal column. That's where she works through Bereshit, Genesis. Any other questions?
I'm interested in elimination of the ego. When you call upon the Divine Mother to do that for you, is it better to do it when you're sort of in a state of meditation, or can you do it without being in meditation?
Your Divine Mother is always with you. If you maintain a constant awareness of her, you'll feel that more strongly. She's always with you. And if you're transmuting your energy and you're really trying to work on your ego, she's helping you. If you don't work on your ego, what can she do? If you're creating more ego and cultivating your desires and feeding your fears and your pride and your envy, she's still there, but she can't save you because you don't want it. You can call on her all the time, and you should, through prayer. Whether you call on her in meditation or out of meditation, she can only eliminate an ego that you've fully comprehended. The reason is that ego is enlivened and empowered by your consciousness, meaning part of your soul is inside of it. When you have fully comprehended that ego, that means that you have fully extracted yourself from it. When you have fully understood it. When you cannot even, there's no way you can repeat that mistake because you are not in it anymore. Then she can eliminate it. And you can pray for that. You can do it while you're standing or meditating or sleeping. It doesn't matter. It's dead already. That ego has no consciousness in it. It's a shell. Then she can kill it. Until then she can't because part of you is still in it. She doesn't want to hurt her child. Right. Is there a question back there?
Yep. A student asked, could you please explain what is Yaldabaoth and Zoe mentioned in Nag Hammadi scriptures?
I think we'll come to that in another lecture. That's another lecture, just that question. Anything else?
So that knowledge, that is intellectual knowledge or hunch?
Right. To repeat, Daath is not intellectual knowledge. Daath is gnosis. It is conscious knowledge. When you comprehend your ego, when you comprehend that your anger towards your relative is wrong, and that your anger causes you to be in pain and causes your relative to be in pain, and then you learn to love that relative and to not be angry with them, but to love them, then you have comprehended that ego, and you have acquired Daath, gnosis. Then you don't need to repeat that resentment. What is there then is love, not anger. The same is true of every ego. Lust, fear. Let's say that you've lost your job. Money's dwindling, and you start to feel very afraid. If you learn to do what you have to do and to trust God to help you, and you keep at it, so that eventually you don't feel the fear, but you start to feel faith, conscious faith, that's comprehension. It can't be faked. You can't get up and say, today I will be faithful in God. I won't be afraid. You can say it, but that fear is still there, right? You can say, oh, that fear is an illusion. I'm not going to believe it. That's fine. But it doesn't dispel the fear. What dispels the fear is real understanding of it. To look into the fear and say, you know what? This fear really doesn't make any sense. I'm on the path. I have my being inside who knows what I need, who knows I need to eat, and I need a place to live, and I need to be warm. You know, I need these things. He knows that. He wants me to do the work. He'll give them to me. What do I need to worry about? Why should I be afraid? And when you sincerely feel that, that's comprehension. That is not easy. And there's no affirmation, there's no intellectual argument for that.
So then that knowledge is of the law and the impure spirit.
It's true. That is true. That's how you see the difference between Tob and Ra. The good and the evil. When you have real comprehension of an ego, the only way you can have that is if you're conscious. If you are centered and seated in that throne, in the mind, in the brain, in the heart, in the sex, the throne of our own goodness, Gedulah, Chesed, our spirit. Our consciousness is connected to that. And when we have our consciousness present and here and strong, that brings comprehension. And then we can see that that ego, that fear that's wanting us to become identified with fear, to be worried about where we're going to live or how we're going to pay for this or that or how we're going to do this and what about whatever situation that's troubling us. When we start to really perceive the difference, you see, this is a matter of perception. Ayin, in Daath. When we start to see that and experience that, that's gnosis. That's Daath. That's real knowledge. You see, I talked about ayin in the context of clairvoyance, but don't think clairvoyance is only extra-physical. Every one of us is clairvoyant. Every image that flickers in your mind is clairvoyance. Every memory, every daydream, every fantasy, every projection, every thought is related to clairvoyance. Clairvoyance, or the power of sight, is this ayin in the midst of Daath. So according to how we see from moment to moment is according to how we perceive or comprehend. When the consciousness is present in us, we rely on God in us, we're relying on the path of Tob, the goodness, in order to see Ra, the impure spirit, inside. This is why we need to self-remember, to self-observe, to meditate.
Can you talk about labeling? Because what happens is many students label the ego and thinking this is comprehension. This goes on all the time in meditation, in forms of what they think is comprehension.
The key point, the key foundation or basis for right view is to not have any preconception. To really be conscious, to really see things as they are, you cannot expect to see anything. You have to see what's there. But in us, we have a mind that's full of projections, full of images and filters that we see through. When you first went to the place you live now, it looked very strange to you. It looked very odd. But as you live there, you stop seeing it. You don't even see it anymore after a while. Because what is there, but what you see is what's in your mind. And this is the simple reason why when you come home, or actually when you're going to leave, you can't find your keys, you can't find your wallet, because you're seeing a picture in your mind that does not relate to what is actually there. You think you left it on the counter, but you actually left it in the other room. But you're projecting an image that has nothing to do with the reality, right? We do this all the time. We do it when we dream. We're not seeing the actual reality in front of us. This is this ayin that is seeing through the asleep consciousness, filtered through projections in the mind. When we learn gnosis, we do the same thing. We learn the teaching and we build a whole series of mental projections about that teaching and what we think it is. And so we no longer see it for what it actually is. And this is why people become fanatics. People become attached. They become followers but not doers. Many Gnostics like that. Many Buddhists and Christians and Jews that have a lot of mental concepts, but they don't see what is actually there. And when we learn to meditate, we still do it. We observe ourselves and we feel a discursive emotion and we say, that's anger. And we label it. And then we go on about our business thinking that we saw it for what it was. But really all we did is we got scared, we put a label on it and ran away. This is what happens. When the ego is really there for us to see it, we don't want to see it. Because it's scary and it's uncomfortable.
Well, pratyahara is a form of meditation that notes ego. Right? So, I mean,
This is why the science of meditation is so incredibly important. When you really develop the ability to meditate, you learn how to position the consciousness in such a way that it does not become distracted by anything. And you will see what is there without blinking, without looking away. This has nothing to do with labels. This is to see it as it is. These are the stages of pratyahara, dharana, and dhyana, in the stages of Raja Yoga. And Patanjali outlaid this very well if you read the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. Or you can read Vivekananda or Swami Shivananda or Samael. All of them explain these stages very clearly. But these are not intellectual. They are stages of conscious perception within which, by the time you reach dhyana and will penetrate samadhi, your consciousness has become capable of seeing without filters. That's what samadhi is. You don't really see without filters until you penetrate samadhi, until you enter into that state. The filters are the ego. So until you're in samadhi, you're in the ego. Right? So what's the point of labeling? An ego can't label an ego.
yeah, but in beginning stages for a student, he has to label to quiet the mind. There's no way to get directly.
Yeah, there are techniques that you can use like that use labeling, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. That's fine. But we're talking about a psychological tendency of labeling, of projection. Anyway, we could talk for hours about that. There's a lot to it. Any other questions before we close?
I had a question.
What's clairvoyance?
Oh, yeah, great question. I should have explained that. Clairvoyance is just a fancy word for imagination. It's the same thing. Clairvoyance is French. It means clear vision. So anytime you use your imagination, you're using clairvoyance. But clairvoyance is different. Like we have different kinds of imagination, right? Most of the time, our imagination is egotistical. We imagine what we want or what we don't want, right? We daydream about our fantasies or our fears. But through learning how to direct attention and cultivate a kind of will over the consciousness, will over imagination. We learn conscious willpower, conscious clairvoyance, which is an ability to perceive without filters of the ego, to see with that same power of imagination, but to see what actually exists. And this is the great power of the ayin in Daath, is to see knowledge and to have comprehension, to see what is, not what we would like, but what is. Thank you.
Thank you.
The presentation of this lecture was made possible by donations from listeners like you. Help Gnostic Radio to help others. Make a donation by visiting gnosticradio.org. For questions and deeper understanding of this lecture, we invite you to explore the wide variety of resources available on our websites. Thank you for your support. May all beings be happy.